So in my last lecture, I introduced you to the concept of the sociological imagination. Remember that this is a concept introduced by a sociologist by the name of C. Wright Mills, and it's a concept that helps us understand the relationship between the individual and the society. Mills argues that the task of the sociologist is to connect our personal troubles with social forces, or what he calls public issues. Mills gives us a really broad sociological lens, and what I want to do in this lecture is to give us some more concrete perspectives in the study of social problems. So here's the problem with the sociological study of social problems. If a sociologist tries to tackle or understand or examine social problems as problems, they're in effect making a value judgment about that issue. And the key to being a sociologist is to be a neutral social scientist, or to study something objectively and to not be making a judgment about it. So let me give you an example here. Let's say I study immigration as a social problem. If I study immigration as a social problem, I'm basically saying that immigration is a problem, something that should be stopped, something that should be resolved. I don't want to do that as a social scientist. I want to be neutral about all the phenomena in society and study it objectively. So how do I study social problems without admitting that they are problems? In 1971, a sociologist by the name of Herbert Blumer came up with some way to resolve this. Blumer said, instead of actually studying the social problem scholars should study how other people define that condition as a problem. Now, a couple of years after Blumer's article, two scholars, Malcolm Spector and John Kitsus, elaborated on this definitional approach. Now, they call their approach social constructionism, but it's basically the same thing. They're focusing on how groups in society make claims or assertions that certain conditions are bad. How did mothers in the 1980s decide to start a campaign to target drunk driving? I keep using this example because if you do the assignment for this unit, you're going to be looking at the history and the organizational structure of MADD, or Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And this is a great example of the definitional or social constructionist approach, because before the 1980s, drunk driving was more or less acceptable. I mean, it certainly wasn't celebrated, but it was a practice that wasn't seen as something horrific or really bad or deserving of harsh punishment. That was until a couple of women decided that this was a condition that was rampant, that was bad, and that needed to be ended for the safety of our streets and the safety of our children. So again, Spector and Kitsus are looking at the process by which certain groups in society, in this case mothers in American society in the 1980s, define a certain condition as bad. And they call that process claims making, because groups are making a claim that a certain condition is bad and needs to be resolved. Spector and Kitsus's approach inspired a generation of social problem scholars. Almost all of it took a constructionist approach. All of it paid homage to Spector and Kitsus's work. And so Joel Best points to like 350 plus journal articles that cite Spector and Kitsus's influential 1977 book called Constructing Social Problems. But here's where it gets interesting. Spector and Kitsus's work and the constructionist approach had almost no impact on the teaching of social problems. Joel Best explains that, quote, a glance through a typical social problems textbook reveals no citation to Spector and Kitsus's work, no entry for claims making, not even a reference to the constructionist approach. Instead, Best argues, these textbooks follow a one problem per week model. And by this he means that they focus on one social problem per chapter per week with almost no analytic framework tying them all together. Given this problem, I chose Robert Heiner's textbook for this course. Heiner, of course, is trying to move away from this one problem per week model. And he's also presenting a framework that ties the study of social problems together. In part, he takes a constructionist approach. So just like Bloomer and just like Spector and Kitsus, he's looking at how groups in society define certain conditions as bad. But Heiner also departs from the constructionist model. Unlike Spector and Kitsus, Heiner focuses on who gets to do the defining. And here he draws on conflict theory, which essentially draws on the work of Karl Marx. Karl Marx, of course, was concerned about the inequalities under capitalism. He focused on the rulers of society, or the elite, the bourgeoisie. According to Marx, the rulers of society get to define the rules of society, and they construct those rules to work to their advantage. In addition, they have power over what he and others called ideology. And ideology is basically the way that people think. So the rulers of society control how the masses think about particular issues. And they can manipulate how they think about certain issues to work in their interests. A great example here would be street crime versus corporate crime. Street crime would be something like auto theft or selling marijuana. Corporate crime would be largely financial crimes or white-collar crimes that are committed by very powerful people. Most wealthy people are not committing street crimes. It's mostly poor people and people of a lower socioeconomic bracket. And so here we have two types of crimes, both of them bad. It's also the case that you are much more likely to be thrown in jail for selling marijuana than you are for selling toxic assets or some other fraudulent financial product. And this is no coincidence to Heiner, and it's no coincidence to critical constructionists, because it's the wealthy and the powerful people in society that are committing the corporate crimes. And again, they construct the rules to their advantage. They construct the laws to their advantage. And so in this sense, they also construct certain problems, such as street crimes, as something more heinous, more dangerous, something that we should be more scared of than corporate crime. So rather than take a purely constructionist approach, Heiner takes an approach that he calls critical constructionism. And critical constructionism, again, focuses on how social problems are defined, but also on how the elite have a lot of power in that claims-making process. Joel Best argues that most students take social problems courses because they're interested in the social problems themselves, not simply in how they get defined. So he says that the sorts of questions constructionists pose are interesting, but they're hardly or even the most compelling questions that we could ask about social problems. And I'm sure this is absolutely the case, that most of you are taking this class not because you want to understand how groups in society construct certain conditions as bad. You're taking the class because you want to explore some of the most pressing issues facing our society. So we're going to take two approaches and try to balance the two. On the one hand, we're going to ask how social problems are constructed socially by certain groups in society, and this would be that definitional or constructionist approach. And then we're also going to look at how social problems are constructed structurally by conditions of inequality. And this is going to allow us to look at these problems in a more applied sense. In the process, I think we'll get a really good handle on the study of social problems in sociology. Thanks.